The day of the accident began like one of those Tuesdays that seem like a carbon copy of the last, with nothing unusual to suggest that your life is about to change forever. Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old literature professor in Portland, left home early, her head full of school assignments and the accumulated fatigue that had become part of her routine. Although she'd felt for months that something in her marriage wasn't right, she tried to convince herself it was just Marcus's work stress. That morning. She quickly drank her coffee, checked a stack of essays she had to grade, and grabbed her car keys, not imagining anything out of the ordinary. There was a strange weight in her chest, a disquiet she couldn't quite put her finger on. But she ignored it. All she could think about was getting there on time and surviving another day of work. The light rain made the road slippery, so Sarah drove slowly, with that automatic alertness you use when you haven't slept well. She would later remember the strange sound when she tried to brake at a traffic light, like a brief metallic scrape, but at the time she didn't think it was important enough to stop. The impact came without warning. The pedal sank, the car lost control and crashed head-on into a pole. Everything went black in less than a second. She felt no immediate pain, only a brutal disconnection, as if she had been ripped from her own body. When she opened her eyes again, she was in an unfamiliar room, with no idea how much time had passed or why she couldn't move anything at all. When Sarah tried to move a finger and nothing happened, she felt a panic she couldn't express. Her mind was fully awake, but her body wouldn't respond. She couldn't even fully open her eyes. It was as if every movement was sealed behind an invisible barrier. She heard footsteps, voices, machines, but she couldn't turn her head or call for help. At that moment, she didn't understand that she was experiencing locked-in syndrome, a rare condition that leaves a person conscious but trapped inside an immobile body. The only thing she did perceive clearly was a feeling of utter loneliness, as if she had been abandoned inside herself without warning. It was in the midst of that confusion that she first heard Marcus's voice. He was speaking in an exaggeratedly sad tone, telling a nurse that he was devastated, that he didn't know how he would go on if she didn't wake up. Sarah wanted to shout that she could hear him, that she was there, but she couldn't. She immediately recognized that forced crying he had never used at home. It seemed absurd and disconcerting. As Marcus continued his act, she felt a mixture of relief and distrust. She didn't understand why, but there was something about his voice that didn't fit the situation, something that would become much clearer in the following days, when she began to overhear conversations she should never have heard. During the first few days, Sarah didn't fully understand what was happening around her. She heard doctors explaining her vegetative state, relatives murmuring prayers, and constant footsteps entering and leaving the room. Every sound was like proof that she was alive inside, even though no one else could see it. Her greatest fear was that they would think there was no hope and make decisions without her input. She desperately tried to move her eyelids, her fingers, anything that would indicate she was conscious, but her body wouldn't obey her. That helplessness stayed with her day and night, mingling with the anguish of not knowing if she would ever be able to communicate again. The situation became even more unsettling when Marcus began visiting the hospital with unexpected frequency. He wasn't the type of husband to rush to hospitals for every little worry, so his constant presence was noticeable. Sarah would hear him exaggerate his role as a devastated husband to the nurses, talking about how much he loved her and how he couldn't bear to lose her. But when he was alone in the room, his silence sounded different. He seemed impatient, restless, as if he were waiting for something. It was during one of these visits that Sarah noticed a subtle change in his breathing, a strange instinct, an alert she couldn't yet explain, but which would soon be confirmed in the worst possible way. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Sarah heard Marcus mention Kelly's name in the hospital room. He was on the phone. believing no one could hear him, saying that everything was going according to plan and that he just needed a little more time. Sarah recognized the name immediately. It was Marcus's new assistant, the same one he'd started talking about far too much in recent months. The mix of anguish and confusion inside her was unbearable. She couldn't move a muscle, but her mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle that made no sense. Yet every word that came out of Marcus's mouth pushed her toward a darker conclusion. The certainty became undeniable when, days later, Marcus entered, accompanied by Kelly. Sarah felt a kind of inner shudder, almost as if the body she couldn't move wanted to react to the woman's presence. Kelly got too close to the bed, speaking to Marcus in a confident whisper, as if they no longer had anything to hide. The nurses assumed she was just a concerned colleague, but Sarah heard the intimate tone between them and the brazen way they laughed at something she couldn't yet grasp. The coldness in their voices, the complete lack of respect for the space of someone supposedly dying, was the first real stab in the back. Sarah began to recall every night Marcus had come home late, every time he had avoided questions, and the truth began to take shape inside her like a devastating blow. It was during Marcus and Kelly's third joint visit that the atmosphere in the room changed completely. They no longer bothered to lower their voices or act as if they were there, only out of concern. Kelly sat in the chair beside the bed, as if that place belonged to her, and Marcus began to speak to her in such a relaxed manner that it seemed impossible he was doing so in front of the woman who was still alive there, listening to everything. Sarah felt a pressure in her chest that had nothing to do with the machines keeping her alive. It was pure terror mixed with rage. She heard snippets of conversations about insurance, pending documents, and dates she didn't quite understand, but which sounded dangerously specific. Everything she had ignored for months now made sense. The worst came when Marcus, believing Sarah to be a mindless vessel, bluntly stated that coming back here every day was an unnecessary drain, and that he wished the whole thing would be over soon. Sarah couldn't cry, couldn't tremble, couldn't react, but inside she was breaking down in a way she had never imagined possible. The familiarity with which they both spoke of their situation was so chilling it felt like a conscious nightmare. Kelly even joked that they had already chosen a place to live when all this is over, and Marcus let out a soft laugh, that laugh Sarah recognized from when he felt completely confident. Every word that reached her ears was a brutal confirmation that something far worse than simple deception was happening. In the following days, Sarah began to notice a disturbing pattern. Marcus and Kelly always came at times when there was less activity in the hallway, as if they were calculating every step. When the hospital staff left the room, they lowered their voices and spoke of things no one with even a shred of humanity would say in front of someone in critical condition. Sarah overheard Marcus comment that the insurance would pay out faster if she didn't show progress, and Kelly responded with a cold tone she never would have imagined from someone so young. Each visit was silent torture, further proof that she was alone, facing something much bigger and darker than betrayal. The final confirmation came one afternoon when Marcus thought they were completely alone. He said bluntly that he had reviewed the insurance documents and that everything was ready for when the time came to disconnect the machines. Sarah felt a brutal emptiness inside, a kind of internal collapse, as if her mind had tried to escape the body she could no longer move. Hearing from her own mouth that she was awaiting her death was not something easily processed. And although Sarah couldn't move a muscle, inside she was screaming. It was like being buried alive, listening as the person who was supposed to be caring for her plotted to end what little she had left. Marcus returned a couple of days later, even more confident. This time he closed the door with his foot, as if the room were some kind of private office where he could say whatever he wanted without consequence. Kelly approached Sarah's bed and placed a jewelry case on the side table. jewelry that Sarah recognized effortlessly. It was hers. It was as if they were draining her of her life while she was still breathing. Marcus told Kelly that everything was finally falling into place, and that once they sorted out the hospital situation, they could move in without worrying about anything. It was at that moment that Sarah understood that it wasn't a misunderstanding or a misinterpreted conversation. They were waiting for her death to begin a life together. Kelly, looking at the machines keeping Sarah alive, asked Marcus how long it would take before they could authorize the disconnection. He replied that he had already spoken with the doctor and that it was just a final push. Sarah felt something warm run down her face. She was crying. No one noticed, but the tears kept falling. And if you, the one watching this video, have made it this far, please tell me where you're watching from and share this story, because someone else might need to hear something like this. Marcus continued talking as if nothing had happened, saying that the funeral would be simple, that he didn't want to spend much, and that he would sell the house immediately. Sarah heard every word like a direct blow to her soul, unable to move a finger to defend herself. That same night, when the hospital was almost silent, Sarah overheard two nurses discussing how Marcus had repeatedly asked about the procedure for removing life support. They said it as if it were the normal reaction of a desperate husband, but for Sarah, it confirmed that he was pushing harder than anyone had imagined. Every word that came from the hallway was like another piece of the puzzle that she now saw with perfect clarity. Marcus wanted her to die, and not only that, he needed it. He wanted to close that chapter as soon as possible so he could continue with his plan. Inside her immobile body, Sarah felt such intense fear that she almost lost track of time. The only person who seemed to see anything differently was Emma Rodriguez, a night shift nurse who always entered quietly, but with a keen eye for detail. Emma would linger a few seconds longer in front of the bed, as if searching for signs that others missed. One early morning, while gently wiping Sarah's face, she noticed a tear that shouldn't have been there. At first, she thought it was just moisture from the air, but when she saw another one slide down Sarah's cheek, her expression changed. She moved closer, observing with a mixture of surprise and doubt. She was the first person to seriously wonder if Sarah was truly as disconnected from the world as everyone assumed. Intrigued, Emma decided to conduct a simple test. She spoke to Sarah in a low voice, asking her to try blinking if she could hear her. She didn't expect a response, but saw an almost imperceptible movement. She remained still, holding her breath, thinking that perhaps she had imagined it all. Then she tried again. "If you understand, me, blink once." And there, right before her eyes, Sarah did it. It was faint, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but enough for Emma to realize that she wasn't facing an inert body, but a trapped mind desperately trying to escape. That discovery shook her to her core. Emma didn't say anything to the rest of the staff at first. She knew that, without clear evidence, they would see her as someone interpreting signals where there were none. So she returned to the room several times. During her shift, repeating small commands, once meant yes, twice no. Sarah, with an effort that drained all her energy, managed to respond on several occasions. It was the first time in weeks that someone had treated her as a conscious person and not as a body sustained by machines. Emma felt a mixture of relief and enormous responsibility. If she was right, and everything indicated that she was, then Sarah had been hearing things for days that no one should be hearing in that state. Once, Emma was absolutely certain Sarah could communicate. She decided to take a riskier step. She brought out a letter chart and began pointing to each row, waiting for the blink that would indicate the correct one. The process was slow, exhausting, and frustrating, but after several attempts, they managed to form individual words. Sarah blinked with all her might, as if each movement were her only chance of survival. When they finally managed to construct the sentence, "Danger, my husband." Emma froze. She had to lean on the table next to her because she felt her legs trembling. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't confusion. Sarah was warning of something serious. Emma knew she couldn't run to the police with just an incomplete sentence, so she went back to the clipboard. Sarah, exhausted, continued to cooperate. Letter by letter, blink by blink, she managed to convey a clearer message. "Branos, cortetados." Emma felt an immediate chill. The accident hadn't been an accident. And if that was true, it meant Sarah's life was still in danger. At that moment, she made a decision that could cost her her job. She discreetly took out her cell phone and hid it behind a folder in the room. If Marcus returned, she would be prepared to record anything that confirmed what Sarah had revealed. The opportunity came sooner than Emma had imagined. Marcus returned that very afternoon, confident, with the same arrogant attitude he'd had the past few days. He stood in front of the bed, sighing heavily, as if he were growing weary of playing the sad husband. From the hallway, Emma pretended to be organizing things, but she'd left her phone recording from a strategic position. Marcus soon began to speak freely, believing he was alone. He said the doctor was already giving in and that he expected the removal of life support to be a matter of days. Sarah listened to everything, feeling each word drag him down further, but at the same time, it was the first time a glimmer of hope had appeared. Now there was proof. When Kelly walked in a few minutes later, their behavior completely lost any trace of caution. They hugged, mentioned they'd already found an apartment they could buy as soon as everything sorted out, and laughed as if they were planning a vacation. Marcus even remarked that everything would be faster if they stopped insisting I wait any longer. Emma, listening from outside, felt a knot in her stomach. Every word was being recorded on her phone. Every sentence was a confession disguised as impatience. Sarah, trapped in her immobile body, wanted to scream, but the only way to do so was to wait for Emma to arrive in time to stop them before they carried out their plan. When Emma finished her shift that night, she couldn't just go home. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, taking deep breaths, listening over and over to the audio recordings she had just made. Each time she played Marcus's voice, speaking with that sickening coldness, it became clearer that she couldn't wait until the next day. She knew Sarah was in real, immediate danger, and that every minute that passed was an opportunity for him to try to advance his plan. That moral weight compelled her to act. She saved the recordings, jotted down quick notes of times and details, and returned to the building to discreetly find the only doctor she trusted enough to share something like this with. Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel, a neurologist with years of experience, listened to the recordings in silence, his expression unchanged, but Emma noticed his posture gradually tensing. He wasn't impulsive or easily swayed by emotions, so when he looked up and said, "This is serious," Emma felt that finally, someone had her back. Patel examined Sarah again that same night, searching for signs of consciousness that had previously eluded him. A series of stimuli and simple commands were all it took to confirm that Sarah was responding. It wasn't a miracle. It was technique, observation, and humanity. And that confirmation changed everything. Patel called two superiors, arguing that it was urgent to reassess the case. He stopped short of mentioning the attempted murder suspicion, but insisted that Sarah was not in a vegetative state and needed additional protection. He requested restricted visits without fully explaining the reason, claiming that the patient showed signs of stress during certain visits. The move surprised some of the staff, but no one objected, especially given the doctor's firmness. Emma used this opportunity to move forward with the next step, discreetly contacting the police. She couldn't risk Marcus returning the next day to find everything exactly as it was. The stakes were too high. The detectives assigned to the case arrived at the hospital before dawn. Emma handed them the audio recordings, explained Marcus's strange behavior, and detailed Sarah's every reaction over the past few hours. They listened intently, pausing to exchange glances that spoke volumes. When they finished, they had no doubts. This was enough to open a formal investigation. They agreed to mount a sort of undercover operation inside the hospital, using Sarah's condition as part of their plan. They would pretend to be preparing to remove her from life support, giving Marcus exactly the opportunity he needed to further incriminate himself. It was risky, but it was the only way to catch him before he attempted anything definitive. The plan began to unfold that very afternoon. The hospital called Marcus, informing him that the medical team needed his final authorization to proceed with the decision that would prevent further suffering for the patient. Marcus's reaction, captured by the detective who called him, was immediate. He didn't ask about Sarah's condition, any changes or treatment options. He only asked what he needed to sign and what time he should arrive. That coldness was recorded on the call. Meanwhile, in the room, Dr. Patel adjusted Sarah's position and explained in a low voice, though he knew she understood, that they would be there the whole time, that nothing was really going to happen. Sarah couldn't respond, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something akin to safety. The hospital had strategically prepared the room. 2 detectives hid in the adjoining room, with a curtain slightly open, from where they could listen and record everything without being seen. Emma remained in the hallway, ready to intervene if anything got out of hand. Dr. Patel took his place by the bed, holding a folder of forged documents as if he were actually going to obtain the signature to disconnect life support. Sarah could hear the movement, the murmurs, the coordinated footsteps. It was strange to feel that everything revolved around her survival without her being able to lift a finger, but she knew that this opportunity was crucial. Marcus arrived with an even more exaggerated performance than usual. He entered wiping his eyes, sighing heavily, as if he were in deep mourning. He greeted the doctor with a tense handshake and approached the bed, taking Sarah's hand as if it were a gesture of genuine love. Trapped in his body, she felt an indescribable mixture of nausea and revulsion. Marcus spoke to her in a low voice, telling her that he was going to set her free, that she didn't deserve to suffer like this. But each of those phrases was a repulsive mask, especially since he himself had been the one to bring her to this state. The detectives watched from the other side, waiting for the key piece of evidence they needed. Following the plan, Dr. Patel opened the folder and explained to Marcus that they needed to review a few points before proceeding. It was then that Marcus let his guard down. He asked directly how long the insurance payment would take to process, if he needed to sign anything else, and if there would be any unnecessary delays. That phrase, unnecessary delays, hanged in the air like an undisguised confession. The doctor looked up, his surprise perfectly calculated, and Marcus, flustered by his own slip, tried to backtrack. But it was too late. The detectives had heard exactly what they needed to hear, and in a matter of seconds the atmosphere shifted completely. Just as Marcus was about to sign the forged documents, one of the detectives entered the room with a firm but controlled stride. Feigning surprise, he greeted Dr. Patel and then looked directly at Marcus, asking if he had a moment to clarify some inconsistencies in the accident report. Marcus froze, unable to react immediately. He tried to regain his composure by saying it wasn't a good time, but the detective persisted. He explained that the insurance company had requested an additional review because something in the vehicle inspection report didn't add up. At that moment, Marcus's expression subtly shifted. He ceased to look like a worried husband and displayed, if only for a few seconds, a nervous tension he couldn't quite conceal. The second detective entered, carrying a folder, and bluntly stated that they had found evidence of brake tampering. Marcus gave a nervous laugh, saying that must be a mistake, that the accident was caused by the rain. However, when the detective played aloud one of the audio recordings Emma had made, the one in which Marcus mentioned that everything would be faster when they unplugged her, the room fell silent. Marcus was completely exposed. He tried to deny the voice, then tried to blame Kelly, then claimed he was emotionally unstable. But every word he uttered only dragged him deeper, revealing a fear he could no longer hide. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus glanced back at Sarah, perhaps searching for one last chance to manipulate the situation. But what he saw froze him in his tracks. Sarah's eyes, which had always been lifeless windows to him since the accident, were now staring directly at him. It was a brief moment, but enough to shatter his illusion that she hadn't heard him. Marcus took a step back, muttering something incoherent. The detectives used that moment to approach and read him his rights. Within seconds, Marcus was handcuffed inside the very room where he had plotted his death for weeks. Sarah, motionless but fully conscious, felt a devastating mix of relief, sadness, and a simmering rage she couldn't express. Kelly was arrested the same day, just a few hours later. Police found her in her apartment, packing documents and clothes as if she were ready to disappear. During the initial interrogation, she tried to deny everything, claiming she was just an assistant caught in a complicated relationship. But the audio recordings incriminated her as much as Marcus. Her voice, her laughter, her comments about the fresh start they would have when Sarah died. As the evidence mounted, her demeanor shifted from brazenness to desperation. For investigators, it was clear she hadn't just been an accomplice. She had actively participated in planning the crime. Sarah, from the hospital, was informed by Emma that they were both in custody. For the first time in a long time, she felt her life was no longer in the hands of her attackers. The days following the arrests marked the beginning of a completely different chapter for Sarah. Although she was still trapped in her body, for the first time she no longer felt the constant shadow of danger hanging over her head. Dr. Patel assembled a specialized team to begin intensive therapy aimed at restoring small, voluntary movements. The exercises were exhausting and frustrating. Each attempt to move a finger required a level of concentration that sometimes gave her a headache. However, Emma was by her side at every session, celebrating even the smallest advances. For Sarah, that support was an emotional anchor in the midst of the most challenging process of her life. The recovery wasn't linear. There were days when Sarah felt she was making progress, managing a stronger blink or a slight tremor in her hand. And there were days when she sank completely, convinced she would never regain control of her own body. The medical team remained steadfast, repeating that every improvement, however small, was a step toward independence. Weeks turned into months, and little by little, Sarah began to move her head slightly, then her jaw, and finally the fingers of her right hand. Each of these achievements brought silent tears to her eyes, but this time they were different tears. Tears of life, not of fear. Over time, doctors introduced new communication tools, including a device that captured micro-eye movements and translated them into words on a screen. This allowed Sarah, for the first time since the accident, to speak directly to her family. Her parents wept as they watched her answer simple questions, and her school colleagues sent messages of support that Emma patiently read to her. Little by little, Sarah regained not only physical abilities, but also the sense of identity she had lost. She understood that there was still a long road ahead, but she was no longer the woman lying helpless in a bed. Now she was a survivor, clinging tightly to every piece of her life. The news of the trial arrived when Sarah could move her lips enough to make faint, though still unintelligible, sounds. The prosecutor in charge of the case visited her in the hospital to explain the process and assure her that they weren't pressuring her to testify. They simply wanted to know if she would ever feel ready. Sarah didn't need to think twice. She had spent weeks listening to Marcus plot her murder without being able to defend herself, and that powerlessness had left a deep scar. Testifying wasn't just a legal obligation. It was a way to reclaim her voice, both literally and symbolically. Although she still couldn't speak, she decided she would use the assistive communication device to recount her experience with absolute clarity. The day of the trial arrived sooner than Sarah had imagined. Although she still relied on a wheelchair and support equipment, the doctors cleared her to attend because her condition was stable. Entering the courtroom was an almost surreal moment. The murmur of the public, the silent flashes of the journalists, the sharp sound of footsteps on the floor. It was all too much, yet at the same time, necessary. Marcus was already there, seated next to his lawyers, avoiding eye contact with her. The tension was so intense that Sarah felt an involuntary tremor in her jaw, something that hadn't happened since the first weeks of her recovery. But she knew that this tremor wasn't weakness. It was the weight of the moment. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. The judge asked that the assistive communication device be turned on, and a screen projected the words she selected with micro-eye movements. It wasn't quick or fluid. Each sentence took time to construct, letter by letter. But that only made each word more powerful. She began by explaining that she had been conscious from the first day. Then she recounted with a precision that left more than one person gasping for breath how Marcus and Kelly talked about disconnecting her, how they laughed, how they detailed plans as if she were an object and not a person. Each projected word was an open wound made testimony. Marcus tried not to look at her, but when the screen displayed the phrase, "I heard everything," he couldn't escape the shock. His hands trembled visibly, and one of his lawyers had to touch his shoulder to snap him out of it. The prosecutor requested that the audio recordings Emma had made be played, and upon hearing them in the courtroom, even people who didn't know Sarah felt nauseous. The coldness, the impatience, the laughter, nothing about it sounded like a man in mourning. It sounded like someone expecting to collect a reward. The jurors exchanged indignant glances, and Sarah, though motionless, felt the silent support of the entire courtroom. Marcus's defense tried to argue that he was under emotional stress, that he didn't know what he was saying, that the recordings were taken out of context. But every word they uttered seemed to worsen the jury's perception. Sarah, exhausted from the effort of testifying, was escorted out of the courtroom by Emma, who had obtained special permission to be present. As she gently guided her down the aisle, Emma told her she had been brave, that her testimony would change the course of the case. Sarah couldn't respond with words, but her eyes filled with tears that spoke volumes. For the first time, she felt she was truly reclaiming her life, one painful piece at a time. The verdict came after several hours of deliberation, though to Sarah, it felt like an eternity. When the jury returned to the courtroom and the foreman announced that Marcus was guilty of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy, a heavy silence filled the room before emotions erupted. Marcus lowered his head, finally realizing there was no way out. Sarah, seated in her wheelchair, closed her eyes for a few seconds, not from exhaustion, but to allow her mind to process the weight of that moment. She wouldn't get back the years they had shared, nor the trauma she had endured, but she was regaining something equally important: the certainty that her life had value and that no one else would decide for her. Kelly received a lesser but equally significant sentence: 10 years in prison for her active role in the plan to erase Sarah from existence. When they led her away in handcuffs from the courtroom, Sarah felt not hatred, but a profound weariness, the kind of exhaustion only felt by someone who had survived the unthinkable. In the following months, she continued with intensive therapy and little by little regained more stable movement. She managed to stand with assistance, then walk with support, and finally take her first steps without it. Each advance was accompanied by tears, effort, and a sense of rebirth that was anything but romantic. It was pure survival. Over time, Sarah sold the house where everything had begun to crumble and moved to a small, light-filled apartment where she could finally breathe without fear. Emma became her best friend, almost like a chosen sister, and together they celebrated every achievement, from moving a finger to walking unaided. Sarah returned to teaching, laughed again, and felt in control of her own story once more. And if you, the viewer, have made it this far, please like and share this story with someone who needs to hear that life can rise again, even after the worst. Sarah was never the same, but she rebuilt her identity with strength, truth, and a courage that no one can ever take away from her.